This is NEGOTIATEx podcast, show number 116. Hello, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx podcast. My name is Nolan Martin. With me joining is Aram and Nolan. Aram, do you want to kick it off for today?
I will, Nolan. Thanks. And have we got a great surprise for our listeners? Someone who really does work with mid-level managers who want to elevate their influence in a variety of ways. So today's program is right on topic. Folks, today we're joined by Fred Jandt, a professional negotiator, mediator, and educator, author of over 30 books to include Win-Win Negotiating, published in 1985 and translated into 7 different languages. Fred has conducted hundreds of seminars in conflict resolution for businesses, government, and public service organizations, as well as individuals wanting to become mediators. Major clients include the California Department of Transportation, the American Medical Association, the Social Security Administration, GT Sylvania, and the U.S. Postal Service. Fred's focus is on how mid-level managers can more effectively use negotiation skills in their interactions with other agencies and the public. Now, Fred's other area of expertise is intercultural communication. He is the author of the highly successful college text, Intercultural Communication. He and psychologist Paul Peterson led the Asia Foundation Conference in Malaysia that resulted in the book Constructive Conflict Management, Asia Pacific Cases. Fred was a professor at several major universities, and before retiring, he served as the dean of the Palm Desert campus of California State University. Fred maintains an active blog focusing on dispute resolution and mediation at mediatorfred.com, as well as on LinkedIn and Facebook. Fred, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So perhaps we could start by hearing a bit more about your journey in the field of negotiation and conflict management, Fred. Did you set out for a career doing this sort of work, or did it somehow find you? I guess we're just curious about kind of key milestones and people who influenced your path.
I think the steps started with an association with the Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations. And that was my first real introduction to negotiation and mediation in labor management. And from there, I had wonderful experience with the professional mediators at Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. They are wonderfully trained individuals, do tremendous work in labor management, and have had much influence in how we do mediation today in the U.S. And then I had the privilege of understanding and learning from the early community mediation programs, particularly the Rochester, New York Community Mediation Dispute Service Project and the San Francisco Community Board programs. And one thing that struck me out of both of those early community mediation programs was that people really didn't understand negotiation and really needed negotiation skills when they were in conflict. And even some people who were very talented managers, when they were faced with the reality of tough conflict, sort of forgot those skills. And it really became clear to me that to be successful in dispute resolution, people needed negotiation skills.
Absolutely. Before we kind of dive into your books, I'd like to set the stage by asking you to share your views on conflict and how it is or isn't managed well within organizations, between companies, and with individuals as we sit here in 2025. What's changed or remained the same since you wrote the Win-Win Negotiation 40 years ago?
Well, what has not changed is that conflict is inevitable. As much as people might like to believe that we don't need conflict, we need conflict. As much as people might want to suppress conflict, it can't be suppressed. Conflict is inevitable. So it's more a question of managing it productively for individuals and for organizations. But I'd like to share with you a study done by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, which is a European-based human resource organization of human resource professionals from over 120 countries. 2024 report of over 5,000 workers. These are some major conclusions. Top management tends to think of conflict management in terms of formal resolution procedures, and they tend to believe they're effective. All right. But in reality, very few employees actually escalate conflict to the formal resolution processes. So there's a great deal of conflict that's simply not addressed, and top management isn't aware of it. In fact, the most common response to conflict by almost more than half to 2/3 of respondents was just to let it go, to do nothing. So that doesn't mean that the conflicts had no consequences. In fact, those people were much less satisfied with their job, were less productive, had negative mental and physical health consequences, and were more likely to leave. So the conclusion was top management believes conflict management is dealt with by formal processes in place. But in reality, mid-level people don't use them, and they just let the conflicts simmer and be non-productive. Then there was a study 16 years ago by CPP across many Western European and U.S. North American countries. It was on what employees believe managers should do with conflicts. Fewer than 10% felt that management should do nothing, and more than 40% believe that managers should actively be mediators to help employees deal with conflicts. So I hope you see the picture. The picture is top management doesn't believe it's there. Employees have it, don't do anything with it productively, and it has negative consequences for employees and the organization. And employees want managers and supervisors to help them deal with conflicts. So that's what's changed.
Wow. Those are pretty staggering numbers, and the mindset behind those numbers, both from top managers who either don't see it or don't have the skills, and then employees who need them to step up. Pretty powerful stuff there, Fred. As you got into your book, Negotiation and Mediation, there's this focus on common assumptions. And I think specifically when it comes to conflict resolution, I think it relates to what you're talking about. Underlying this, whether it is on the manager side or the employee side, we know there would be some benefits to when mid-level managers commit to improving their skills in this area. What is it that gets in the way? What biases, mindset, thinking, assumptions we make? What prevents us from improving our skills, even though what you just painted is we need to?
Good questions. Let me just list three that I think are major blocks. And the first one is one that we hear all the time, and that's people who say, well, conflicts are just a problem in communication. It's just a communication problem. Well, it's just simply not true. The truth of the matter is sometimes if people communicated more clearly, they would discover that those conflicts are very real and very deep. So it's not a communication problem. The second assumption is that we should avoid conflict because conflict destroys relationships. It's just simply not true at all either. There's some just basic facts to consider here. First of all, conflict is a product of relationships. Conflicts are inevitable in relationships. And in fact, the more meaningful the relationship, the more likelihood that the conflicts will be intense. So what we need to is productively deal with conflict, and that can in fact strengthen relationships. There's no benefit to avoiding conflicts. And the third, which is the one that I emphasize all the time, is the assumption that we tend to make, and it's so prevalent in the U.S., is that the best way to deal with conflicts is simply compromise. And this one really is a problem for me because compromise is certainly one way to deal with conflicts. In many ways, it is a good way, but there are better ways to deal with conflicts. And it goes back, if I could, to a misunderstood and long neglected management professional, Mary Parker Follett. She was active in the 1920s, actually, the first woman to address the London School of Economics. She was an advisor to President Theodore Roosevelt on the management of nonprofit organizations. But her emphasis was, of course, that collaboration, which is simply a way of finding solutions that benefit both parties, is much stronger, not only in outcome, but in strengthening the relationship than compromise is. So yes, compromise works, but there are better ways.
Boy, I love all three of those points. I just wrote Nolan, right? I mean, those are on target. And Fred, the way you laid those three things out, I agree. I think most people see conflict as a communication problem. Not true. Conflict avoidance actually can hurt relationships more. Yeah. And compromise, has its time and place, and it has some limitations. So yeah, nicely laid out. Thank you.
Fred, we've interviewed a number of authors on this topic over the past several years, but you are the first to discuss how ancient cultures and various religions, traditions inform and impact how we engage with, perhaps naturally respond to conflict in our lives today. Could you share with our listeners a little about what you see as the carryover from the past to how we negotiate with the influence others today?
That's a really interesting question. I've given that some thought as to how to give a good answer to that. And one way I think we can approach it is to look at how we define the word peace. And it's interesting that in most Western cultures, we define peace in a negative way. It is the absence of war. And of course, that's a completely legitimate definition. But we can look at how other cultures define peace, and we find a slightly different perspective. Rather than looking at it as the absence of war, it's more likely to be defined more in terms of harmony. And that's an interesting, subtle distinction. So in Confucian China, the emphasis on harmony over rights of the individual is predominant in Chinese culture. And you might find it interesting that there are 4 million mediators in China today, which is far more than the number of judges and lawyers in China. So I think what we see here is the emphasis on harmony leads to ways in the institutions to promote harmony. And it's done through mediation rather than lawyers and judges.
Fascinating number again. And I love the focus on different definitions. We're going to get into some intercultural dynamics a little later and kind of harness more of your expertise there. You know, you spend quite a bit of time in your text discussing ethical aspects of negotiation, to include how does one manage information ethically, as well as being aware of, ethically questionable tactics maybe that we use or someone else uses. In your mind, why should today's modern negotiator even be concerned with these things?
Another good question. If you look at most negotiating text today and theorists in negotiation, generally the consensus is that when people enter into negotiation, they expect bluffing and deception, for example. And because we enter into it with that expectation, bluffing and deception are not unethical. What makes them acceptable is that we expect them to be there. Okay. And I completely understand that. No problem with that at all, as long as people enter into it with the understanding that might happen. Okay. But the interesting thing today to me is the new emphasis on transactional negotiation. The term came to mean that each party gives and gets. And on the surface, that seems fine. But there are 3 other considerations. I think one is that transactional relationships are solely based on reciprocity, that there's no consideration of ethics, morals, or principles, purely reciprocity. Second, there's no emotional component or personal investment in transactional relationships. And third, they are definitely limited by time. In other words, when the benefit to either or both parties is over with, the relationship is gone. It's history. So I have some questions about looking at transactional negotiation as ethical. I think there are some difficulties when parties are into it without knowing what it means.
I think we would agree, right? It's a powerful framing because I think transactional negotiation is so familiar or rampant today. I think a lot of folks would probably just step into it without even considering those 3 things.
Both Aram and I have spent a significant amount of time overseas involved in cross-cultural engagements. From your experience, perhaps focused on the Asia-Pacific region, but also more generally, what are the key things negotiators need to manage when operating in a foreign culture?
Any person involved in cultural studies will give you a long list of factors that could influence, as you well know from your experience. And I was thinking if I would identify one thing that is across cultures, an issue to remember in dealing with cultures, I want to actually nominate 2. And the first is to remember that individuals negotiate, not cultures. So when a person from another culture is negotiating, don't assume that they represent the stereotype of that culture. We negotiate with individuals, not with cultures. But secondly, notwithstanding, the one thing that I think makes a difference is the concept of face. And face is actually important in almost all cultures, but face is more important in some cultures than in others. And I think recognition of how to deal with face can help us in most kind of intercultural communication challenges. I'm trying to think of an example that can I give you an example?
Please do, yeah.
Okay. I mentioned the number of mediators in China, and I give you an example of that, is that there was a case of a Japanese production company that made a television series called Ultraman, and a Shanghai department store, when the series was broadcast in China, began to sell little figures based on the characters in that TV show. Well, then The Japanese production company then worked with a Chinese company to sue that department store because they had not received rights to do that sale. How would you imagine that case would be handled in U.S. courts, right? Pretty extensive litigation over violation of copyright, probably massive settlement, right? Okay. How it was handled in China was that it was agreed that the department store would send a representative to Japan to apologize, to explain that they didn't fully understand the copyright laws and offer a compensation, which in US dollars was a little under $100. All parties were happy. And what was the important part of it was the apology, saving face for that mistake. So I think saving face is that one component which we can use across cultures that has the most power.
I would say, Nolan, I'm sure you've got experiences. I can think of examples from serving in Afghanistan where there was no way. We're in a room, there's a leader, we're talking, but there's others in the room. They can't say yes with the people in the room. But if we can step out on a balcony, the nature of the conversation can shift and we can understand what their real concerns are. And we might be able to actually engage them in problem solving, in that collaboration that you were talking about earlier.
You gave a perfect example in that you can't back down in front of others, which is why even in the U.S., security people remove a disruptive person from an audience. They can't back down in front of an audience.
Right. How much of this face piece also is, I guess, flipping it a little bit on my showing face? And I guess what I mean by that is some vulnerability. One of the things, at least within the military ranks that Nolan and I would talk to, simple things like a sign of respect that helps engagement is taking that helmet off, taking the sunglasses off, connecting, a little bit more intimately with someone. Is that another way to think about this concept of face?
Absolutely. I think it's a general way to bring together so many of the cultural elements in a ways that make sense.
So, Fred, we've only had a handful of guests discuss mediation. This is an area in which you're obviously an expert and you still do significant work. For someone who's listening to the podcast for the first time, could you describe what is mediation as different from negotiation, when it can be helpful in a situation, and what is it that a capable mediator must get correct to best ensure the chances of a successful resolution?
A mediation, let's define it this way. It's got to be a voluntary process. There's a third party neutral who is truly impartial and has no involvement in the dispute, meets with disputing parties to help them identify the issues and explore options to reach a settlement. Okay, the important element is self-determination. That is, the parties must agree to that process and must develop that solution themselves. Many people in the U.S. have experience with child custody and visitation mediation, and that's a separate creature. That has its own rules and regulations, and that's different from what we find in the business and professional segment. The important things are impartiality and no conflict of interest by the mediator, and self-determination by the parties. Now, what can be in mediation today? It's community mediation programs, court-referred mediation, labor management, family, couple, teen, elder, peer mediation in schools, special education mediation programs, victim offender mediation. Today, mediation is growing rapidly in our society in a wide range of disputes, from neighbor-neighbor disputes to the NFL $1 billion settlement over concussions, which was mediated.
As you described that, and you talked earlier, you were talking about many managers don't have these skills, but employees want them to step in as mediators. You talk about impartiality and so forth. Can managers do that sort of work? And are they the best ones? Or should organizations be bringing in third party external to the company to mediate workplace disputes?
The distinction that I make here is I don't recommend that managers and supervisors become mediators and hold themselves out to be mediators. What I do recommend is that they learn how to use mediation skills. And you can use the skills to deal with situations on the floor without having it appear to be a formal sit down around the table mediation. So what I'm advocating is that managers and supervisors learn the skills of mediation.
That makes tremendous sense.
So now switching back to your book, Conflict and Communication, could you share a bit about how common power dynamics and conflict styles affect a manager's ability to resolve a situation, whether it's with an external customer or an internal team member?
Some time ago, I was privileged to be a consultant to, since you identified it in the introduction, it was Caltrans, California Department of Transportation. And that organization had a history of, let's say, doing what it wanted to do, but the world changed and there were community groups that had agendas. There were environmental groups that had agendas. There were local transportation agencies that wanted new standards. So in a world where they could no longer do exactly what they wanted when they wanted, managers had to learn how to be cooperative with other groups. So I was involved in a multi-year training program for all mid-level managers in that organization, which is hundreds of people. The purpose of that training was to develop skills in negotiation skills so that the parties would be able to work with other groups to influence and create change. So one thing that I did for them, which I think is a good way to begin, was to develop a scheme for analyzing conflict situations. So rather than when faced with a situation to act, the first step that I encouraged them to do was to analyze the situation and then plan their action. So, for example, the steps, I won't go through all the steps, but we talked about the context in which the conflict was occurring, who were all the parties, the political parties and organizational parties, who was involved in the conflict, who were cooperating in the conflict, identifying the issues, then looking at the parties' demands and interests in the situation, then begin to look at how each party looked at social reality, how they wanted to resolve the conflict, what skills they could bring to the conflict, what their beliefs about what the right way to do it were, how to involve outside interested parties, how to look at the power dynamics in the conflict, and then how to begin to look for settlement options that took all these factors into account. I think what we did for those managers was to give them a way to systematically analyze potential conflict situations and to be creative in coming up with cooperative outcomes.
You know, it reminds me of, Nolan and I have a colleague who will also say what you described about analyzing the situation, we would agree with, right? Good preparation. It's ready, aim, fire. But some people walk into
fire.
Yeah, right. Fire, aim, ready, or fire, ready, aim, right? It's taking that step back. How do you coach people to be patient when there's this urgency, or at least a perceived urgency to move?
What we would say to that is look at the probability of success.
And that's going to drive it, right? I mean, we can't predict outcomes exactly, but I think you can look at success probability and say, which way are we going to, potentially have more success in this situation? Yeah. I mean, Nolan and I obviously both are negotiation background, but military background, big believers in preparation.
I'd say this way, it happens that it always amazes me that very sophisticated people in dealing with complex management situations sometimes don't think about how to apply those same skills to the simplest conflicts. And I think what we're saying is use those same skill sets to think about how you handle the conflict situation rather than going, as you say, to fire.
So you were talking, you mentioned, one of the reasons these skills are critical is, many organizations are creating change or experiencing change. That can trigger some emotional responses. Emotions are part of conflict. Conflict is inevitable, so therefore emotions are. How can emotions be both helpful and hurtful in conflict resolution situations? And what do you advise negotiators or mediators to think of when it comes to managing emotions?
Well, the most typical emotion that we're talking about is anger. And I think that is the one that we most want to deal with and most want to talk about. And of course, there is healthy anger. There is anger that can lead to productive change. But most anger in conflict situations leads not to good places. So really, how do you deal with anger that you feel in conflict situations? There was, the marriage family therapist that became so well known, John Gottman, used to talk about flooding. And that is that particularly men can become so flooded with emotions that they're not able to deal rationally with conflicts, that need to step away for a while. And Gottman would talk about, it's go for a run, work in the garage or something before you deal with a conflict in the family for particular. But some recent research suggests that may not be the optimum way for most people, that it may simply be to take some quiet time, rather than trying to attempt to deal with conflicts while you're experiencing anger. More recent suggest is step away for a while. just recognize that you're not going to be your most rational, your most productive when you're angry. So don't deal with it. Step away, postpone it.
You said that's what research says. In your experience, does that work well too? And what does stepping away look like? I mean, if Nolan and I are in the middle of a negotiation and all of a sudden I start to get a little angry, I mean, do I just call it for the day? Do we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because think about the consequences of escalating that anger, doing analysis. Yeah.
Back to probable outcomes, probability. Okay.
Fred, we have more modalities by which to communicate now more than ever. How do you advise clients when it comes to effectively using text, email, Zoom, AI, and so on with regard to negotiation or mediation situations?
It's been really interesting what's happened the past few years with Zoom. Pre-COVID, it was just assumed that almost all mediation had to be face-to-face. And with COVID, people didn't know, how are we going to do mediation? We can't do them anymore. So people began to try Zoom. And guess what happened? Today, more mediation is conducted in Zoom than face-to-face. It became more accessible to people as people became familiar with it. And the advantages are that really now most mediation outside of the courts is on Zoom. So that's one change that just has happened in the past few years that's so interesting. The thing now to watch, of course, is artificial intelligence and the assisted negotiation program. So they have a long history. There's been assisted negotiation programs for some time, like Adjusted Winter and Cyber Settle and Smart Settle that helped people negotiate. The real interesting thing today, of course, is the use of chatbots. And the real question is, do we need a human mediator? Can a chatbot replace the human mediator? And there's some interesting things that are happening. I'm sure you're well aware that Walmart implemented a chatbot negotiation program with some suppliers in Canada, and they had good outcomes and the suppliers liked it. So I think we're going to see a lot more automated negotiation and mediation. And I don't think it's anything we need to fear.
Could you elaborate more on that? Because, removing the personal elements, you said that most of the mediations are happening on Zoom. Is it still effective? I mean, the AI stuff, yes, it's effective, but are you still seeing positive results and as much mediation success by them moving from Zoom instead of face-to-face?
No reduction in satisfaction and no reduction in we don't measure settlement rate, but I'm going to artificially say that. There's been no negative effects. In fact, people that like online Zoom mediation.
I was going to go even further and say I think this was past weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal had an article in there about the role of AI bots, as you were talking about, Fred, being more effective in empathetic discussion than humans. And the research that was done was, I didn't know which one I was talking to, but I felt that in one case it's an AI bot, and the other it's a human. We're doing this via chat, and people responded more favorably, saying that the AI bot could practice empathetic conversational methods about understanding the problem. The human was more likely to talk about themselves.
Obviously are going to be shortcomings, but it doesn't appear to be anything that we should fear, as we become better at it. Interestingly enough, China is much further advanced in this than we are as applying this to real life disputes. One program in China is their internet mediation program, and people can actually file a case, submit documents, mediate, have the mediation agreement done all on their cell phones.
And does it matter whether it's transactional negotiations or something that's a little bit more robust and sophisticated?
At this point, it's more transactional.
So in your text, Conflict and Collaboration, you devote an entire chapter to conflict with families. I was shocked that conflict ever occurs within families. What is unique, in your opinion, about how conflict shows up within families? What can we apply from the skills and concepts that you've been sharing and discussing to better address issues that arise with spouses, partners, parents, children?
One thing I mentioned earlier was that the more personal and important the relationship is, the likelihood that the conflict can be more intense. So I think it's important for people to accept that families are the most important relationship we have, and potentially the conflicts there can be the most intense. We have to accept that, but also recognize this very important thing about conflict. We only are in conflict with people we care about. If we didn't care about them, we'd let it slide, right? So the conflict indicates our awareness and acceptance of the importance of that relationship. Last night, I started a new mediation class for people wanting to be volunteer court mediators. But a typical thing in after mediation training is that the people tell me that even if they're not going to be volunteers, the class has helped them understand how to deal with conflict in their family. So I think what I would again say here, like in organizations, I'm not saying that people become mediators, but I think the mediation mindset is something that we can use in our families.
Nolan, I won't speak for you. I know my wife would like me to practice some of these things more than just talk about them. Fred, I won't. Maybe I put you on the spot. I'm sure you master these in all your personal relationships too. Very easy to apply, right?
Well, I often tell people it's not always easy, but at least it's possible.
Yeah, I don't know what to talk about, Aram. Mine's perfect. Before we conclude, could we ask you to share a personal negotiation or mediation failure that you learned from, an experience that you still apply today?
I'm going to broaden that question a little bit because rather than any one particular case, I'm going to generalize into cases that have been problems. Okay. And without a doubt, in negotiation or mediation, the situations when have been the most difficult is when there's been a significant imbalance of power between the parties. In litigation and in mediation, when one party believes they're right and they have the money and the power, they're not going to want to mediate. If they do mediate, it's just show. In some cases, I will stop a mediation when one party feels that they are in such a disadvantaged power situation that they cannot really act in their own self-interest. Self-determination is not possible. Even in our courts today, we recognize that people with more money and more resources have an advantage. So it's the discrepancy of power that is a problem. And that's why I advise people going into mediation and negotiation always to assess, the WATNA or the BATNA. What is going to be the alternative? Do you have alternatives to entering into this negotiation? Maybe you should consider some alternatives before you begin the negotiation. At least always be aware of the alternatives to not settling. I find it kind of interesting today that both political parties are going back to the writings of Saul Alinsky, who was one of the interesting people in community activism and power. And Alinsky always said that there are only two sources of power, money and people. And I think the discrepancy in power has been the challenge in negotiation and mediation.
So Fred, let's just build in one more moment on what you just shared in terms of those challenging circumstances. I know a number of folks who need to negotiate upward, and we talked earlier about the skills of the manager to help mediate a situation maybe amongst subordinates. If I'm junior to you and I'm trying to influence you with a proposal or a project or whatever it might be, how can I do that most effectively, really manage, really be a good influencer upward? Are there certain things I should just be practicing?
That's a big question to answer. I think we've got to begin with the recognition of the power discrepancy and understand what the possible consequences of that power discrepancy are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, say a little bit more. I guess if you are senior to me, do I need to get you to acknowledge that there's a power discrepancy which is impacting our ability to converse?
I think you can be smart and show the other party, the higher power party, how they are advantaged by your proposal.
Speak into their language, understanding of their needs and concerns.
Show them the advantage to them.
Which means a deep understanding. Going back to the relational component, there needs to be a deep understanding of you as my boss's concerns, what keeps you up at night, and so forth.
There are many wonderful, good ideas that don't get adopted because those ideas aren't sold. And the question is, what is the value of a great idea unless you can sell it?
I agree. That's actually a starting point that I use for many of my classes, which is we build these skills around analytical tools around marketing and finance and accounting to make wise, decisive decisions. And at the end of the day, if I can't influence someone to action, it was all for naught.
A good idea is not worth anything unless it's adopted. So what are you willing to do to move it forward?
Well, Fred, thanks so much for joining us today. As we wrap up, final question is, do you have a final thought or challenge that you would like to, send to our listeners who are seeking to become more persuasive influencers and more skilled conflict transformers?
I think, as I said earlier, it's not always easy, but it's usually possible.
Persistence, patience. I mean, I think in our most intensive conflict situations, they're not easily solved immediately.
Correct.
What's the longest mediation you've ever been part of?
Oh, I think there are two factors there. That on the surface is simple, but ended up being long, even though because it was more complex. The first thing that came to mind was a very simple mediation over a dog bite, a neighborhood dog bite. And this should have been handled in half an hour. It ended up being like 8 hours. And it's not the longest I've ever done, but this one was 8 hours. And the story was a man was in his backyard with his 3 small children, and his neighbor's dog started coming under the fence. So he went to the fence and started pushing the dog back under the fence, and the dog bit him. So he later sued his neighbor for medical costs, and that went to a court-referred mediation to me. I expected this to be relatively simple. It ended up being quite complex because the story as it developed was the man went to the fence because he was afraid the dog was going to hurt his small children. That was his motivation. That's what he was afraid for. But he had never met his next-door neighbor. His next-door neighbor was a retired couple with no children, and as they described it, that dog was their child. And they were terrified that this man was going to take their child away from them. And that's why they were so embittered in this dispute. And the outcome was that they became neighbors. They worked together to put in a better fence. The elderly couple actually ended up helping the young man babysit during the day, and mediation really adjusted their whole relationship. And it took 6 hours. There was great intensity of emotion because the elderly couple were terrified they were going to lose their dog, which was their only child. And it appeared on the surface to be so simple, but it took about 8 hours to get it done.
Good mediation story to end on.
It really is. Yeah, it's a nice example. The power of transformation. And thank you so much, Fred, for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, your texts that you've written on, and just encourage folks to go check out your blog site, mediatorfred.com. Fred, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Hope that met your purpose.
It did. That is it for us on today's podcast. If you haven't already, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode.